Okay, so economic policy is broken into two parts. So kind of in the top left corner, we'll write economic policy. So this has to do with the role of the government in addressing economic matters. And what's the best way for us to gauge how the economy's doing? How do we measure the economy's success or failures? And this might be from your econ class. What's like something we look to as evidence that the economy is struggling or doing great or bouncing back or in decline?
Consumer spending.
Consumer spending, absolutely.
So like consumer spending.
And I heard unemployment. I'm going to put unemployment. So we definitely care about the unemployment rate. And then there's something else that it sort of has to do with spending. It has to do with the cost of things over time.
Inflation.
Yeah, inflation. And what we look to from the Bureau of Labor Statistics is the Consumer Price Index. Does this sound familiar? CPI and CPI. Okay, Consumer Price Index. So if you don't remember what that stands for, you might need to write it out. But these are the two things that tell us about the economy. So that way we can adjust. You know, we can make policies that are going to address maybe a high unemployment rate or rapid inflation as measured by the Consumer Price Index. Both these numbers come monthly from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS. And there's two sides to economic policy. Like we could split it into two parts. There's monetary policy, which should be familiar, and fiscal policy. We're going to spend most of today looking at fiscal policy because I have a feeling you're pretty competent with your monetary policy. Okay, so what I'm going to do is we'll put monetary policy just on the back. So flip on over, and a quick overview. And in past years, I've actually worked with another teacher, Mr. Youngblood, and I kind of knew what was going on more in his class. So I'll be looking to you to tell me some of the things that sound familiar or not familiar, so I'm not repeating myself, or I don't skip over something too fast. Does anyone remember getting like a definition for monetary policy or some feature of it? Or who controls monetary policy? Okay. All right.
I can remember how many times like he got shot for not getting.
Okay, let's just focus on. I'm sure you guys covered this, but maybe you don't have the same vocabulary to get it down. So monetary policy is all about controlling the supply of money. And money supply is controlled particularly by the Fed. So who is in charge of monetary policy is the Fed. Now, when I say the Fed, what am I referring to? The Federal Reserve. Thank you for telling me. If I need to scoot over, don't be shy. Okay, the Fed. Federal Reserve Board. Bless you. Okay, and the Federal Reserve Board is set up in 1913, and we call it just the Fed. What's interesting about the Fed is the people on it aren't elected. They are appointed, and then the Senate approves of the appointment with a 2/3 vote. That 2/3 probably sounds familiar. The Senate approves with the 2/3 vote, just like justices and ambassadors. So these people are not elected, but they go through the typical Pres appoints, Senate confirms process. It's 7 people, and their terms are 14 years. It's a pretty long term. the purpose of this is that they're supposed to be sort of insulated from politics. Kind of like our Supreme Court. So what are their goals? Well, if we said that they address problems like unemployment and inflation, their goal is going to be to make sure unemployment doesn't get too high and also make sure we have stable prices. So their goal is to help with unemployment and have stable prices and really a stable dollar. Now I'm sure it's starting to look familiar again. So the Fed can reach these goals in 3 primary ways. So the 3 things the Fed does in order to control the supply of money and therefore help with stabling the dollar and unemployment. Can anyone think of one way the Fed can control the supply of money? How much money is out there? What if they want to lower the amount of money that's out there or raise the amount of money that's out there? By out there, I mean in the economy. Hold on. Sierra?
Yeah. Does taxing have anything to do with raising and lowering taxes?
With fiscal policy, which is what we're going to spend most of today on. So you're right going that direction. I really need to practice names, so I'm going to go for the ones I'm struggling with, which would be, I'm struggling with you. Tell me your name.
Hannah.
Hannah.
Do they coin more money?
Yes, they can. They're in charge of coining money, but once they coin money, how do they get it out there? So yes, they can actually produce the money, but they don't just run out in the streets and go money for everybody. So how do they get the money out there? Rose?
Don't they buy U.S. debt?
Yes. Yes. So they can buy. Can you all see that? Buy and sell securities. So if they want to put more money out there, they're probably going to sell securities. But if they're trying to lower the amount of money out there in the economy, then they're going to buy up securities. Is it okay if I skip over what securities are? That was somewhat covered. It's how we loan the government money, but also how we can turn a profit. I really need someone to speak up if I need to go over that.
Bonds.
Bonds, yes. So if you feel comfortable with bonds, you can think of that. Securities encompasses more than bonds, but it's okay if you're with just bonds. So, and in case you forgot, this is lending to the government. Okay. Another way we can get money out there, get more money in the economy. How can we sort of inject money? Marie Claire?
Raise minimum wage.
That's fiscal policy. So very good idea. It's going to be on the other side of the sheet because the Fed doesn't get to do that. That's what Congress is debating about. Okay, so we're talking about things that Congress doesn't do. Things Congress also gets to make the budget. Yeah.
They control interest rate?
Yes, they set the interest rate or the discount rate. I don't know what Mr. Cheney used. They set the discount rate or interest rate if you're more comfortable with that. So what that means is they're going to set the rate at which money can be bought. And you buy money when you get a loan. You're saying, I need that money. I'm going to pay you more for that money over time. And they're setting the interest rate for banks. So if the interest rate for banks is low, well, that's good for us, the people who might want to borrow money. So if it's a low interest rate, more people are going to be able to borrow money, and that's going to infuse the economy with money. If we raise the interest rates, there's going to be less lending and less money out there. And the final one has to do with the reserve requirement. The FDIC requirement sets how much should be sort of reserved in the banks in the case that there were some sort of run on the banks. And if we have that reserve requirement really high, the banks won't be able to allow for as much money out. But if we lower the reserve requirement, then more money will be in the economy. And that's it for monetary policy, okay, because that's really more an economic domain, but it does come up. What you're going to want to know is monetary policy is not fiscal policy. It's what the Fed does. It's what unelected officials decide. And their goals are these goals over here. And we want them to be insulated from politics because these are important economic goals to have a stable economy. We don't want them swayed by what the Republicans or the Democrats are saying. We want them thinking, how do we keep the economy here healthy? Okay. Let's then flip over to some of the topics you guys were going to get us to, which is all about fiscal policy. You tell me if I need to zoom in, zoom out, move things over. Make sure I stay on track. So fiscal policy. It describes how we tax, spend, and borrow. Essentially creating our federal budget. So this describes all the decisions our elected officials are going to make. And there's really three things you can do when it comes to fiscal policy: tax, spend, and borrow. Okay. So let's go with probably the more boring part first. Get that out of the way, and that's the process, how we make a federal budget. Does anyone know how to make a Prezi? I've made one in my life. It was such a pain. I'm too old to adapt to these new things, but this would be an amazing Prezi. I should make that extra credit. Someone turn this into a Prezi for me. Or teach me how to make a podcast, one or the other. Okay. So your budget is going to be made mainly by Congress. So let's put Congress in the middle here, but leave room because we're going to talk about what happens before and after Congress. Congress is really the second step. But Congress is going to be, have the power of the purse. They decide how to spend the money. They decide how to appropriate money, where money should go. And they also decide how to tax, how to collect the money. Interested in this is not Congress as a whole. How does Congress really work? They don't work as a whole. It's not 535 people getting together and making up ideas together. 535 people trying to get together and make any sort of cohesive plan is going to be a mess. So how does Congress really work to get things done? Yeah, committees and subcommittees. So remember that they work in committees and subcommittees. Now, every different committee is going to have a separate interest in how much money should be appropriated to maybe their corresponding bureaucratic agency. So how are we going to get all those committees on the same page about how to spend money? We can't have one committee wanting to spend money here without thinking about the money that goes somewhere else. So there's one important office, the Congressional Budgetary Office. That's an N. The CBO. I'm going to refer to it as that from now on. The CBO is supposed to talk to all the different committees and figure out how to put it all together into one plan. How to make it coherent, how to make it add up.
What is this?
Congressional, and I'm sorry. Trouble there. Okay, but before Congress comes up with this brilliant plan, really it starts with the president, because the president does have a role in legislation. The president gets to propose. So he can make some suggestions about how to tax and where money should be spent. And he's going to send his proposal over to Congress, and then they're going to make additions and argue and hopefully come up with a budget. Now, below the president are what? What's below the president? He's at the top of the
Bureaucracy.
bureaucracy. And he's got all those agencies below him, and what do bureaucrats want? They want more money so that they can expand their agencies. So he has to communicate with all his agencies. They're going to submit the amount of money they want. He has 15 cabinet departments below him, dozens of regulatory agencies, other independent executive agencies. How can he sort of get all of them on the same page for his proposal? He, like Congress, has sort of his own CBO. It's called the OMB, Office of Management and Budget. Office of Management. So all these agencies that want money, they're going to submit them to the OMB, how much money they want, how much they want to expand, and then the OMB is going to put it all together, hopefully in a nice plan that the president then sends to Congress. And in a very similar process, all the committees and subcommittees are going to have ideas for how they want to spend money, whether it be in their own district or for a related agency. And in reality, this is where, since the 90s, the process stops and Congress really doesn't come up with a budget. But let's pretend Congress was working, okay, for the sake of the AP test. And then, like any legislation, after something is passed in both the House and the Senate, where does it go? To the president. So the president's kind of at the beginning and the end, but he's not really the major decider. And the president can sign it into law. That looks like it would work so well. Now, I said that it hasn't really been happening that way, and that's unfortunately the case. Very often Congress gets stuck here with politics and partisan rhetoric, and they don't come up with a budget. So what happens when Congress doesn't actually come up with a budget? What do they do when they can't all agree? They kind of kick it down the road with what's called a continuing resolution. So insert here a CR. You might have heard on the news talking about clean CR. That's a continuing resolution. And here's how it works. Remember how there was a budget last year? Let's just take that one. But we have a larger population and inflation. So let's just take the previous budget and add more money. Okay. There's a vocabulary term for this. It's called incrementalization. It's the idea that use budget from before plus a bit more. There's some additional vocabulary here for other things, other bills that come out of this, like an appropriations bill or an authorization bill. That's in your vocabulary, so we're going to kind of skip over that, and you guys can learn that later, and then we'll put it all together when we study and review. So this is how it works technically. What profoundly influences this process? That would be your interest groups. So they're not really in there, but I want to remind us that there are interest groups, and they really care about how we tax, spend, and borrow. And there's my iron triangle. Now, making a budget is probably the most political thing we can do, because how you spend your money reflects values. So how the government taxes and spends is probably the best indicator of what the government really cares about. And we hope that people are paying attention, like the media and the public. Because it's one thing to say, oh, we should improve this or we should change that. It's another thing to actually put it in the budget and make it happen. Okay, heading a different direction. Does anyone have questions about the process? Final note, it's been a long time since we've passed a budget. We keep doing continuing resolutions. Okay, how to balance. This is important. How to balance the budget. Well, that means that the money in should be equal to the money out. Thank you. So that means there's two sides, money in, money out. Money in. What do we call that? Revenue. And we get it typically through taxing, but we can get money in some other ways too. So how do we get money? 3 ways. Karen, you said taxing. Specifically, what kind of tax do we use to get money for the federal government? The income tax. The income tax. And that is set up in the 16th Amendment. Passed in like 1913. It had to be passed by amendment because when Congress would make legislation for the income tax, the Supreme Court kept striking it down, saying it was unconstitutional. So the best way to make something constitutional that the Supreme Court says is unconstitutional is write it into the Constitution. Okay, the other way we get money for a specific program would be social insurance taxes. And there's really 2 of those. There's Social Security and Medicare. And these 3 things all come out of your paycheck. If you look at your, does anyone have a paycheck yet? All right, when you look at it, you'll probably see something like Fed W/H, federal withholding, that's the income tax. And then you might see something like FICA for the federal insurances, which are more than just those 2, but those are the main ones. It includes like unemployment insurance and some other things. So the idea here is this goes to the federal government. Now this is supposed to be going to these programs. And finally, we can borrow money. And that is monetary policy. How does the government borrow money? Well, they sell bonds or sell securities. And that helps to take money out of the economy in case, and we would want to do that when we have a problem with inflation. Just for a point for my reference, did Mr. Cheney talk about this kind of stuff? He wasn't supposed to, but I'm just curious if he went that direction at all.
It was in our like books a little bit.
Okay. Well, it is my domain, so that's okay. All right, and the money out part. Let's put that further down here. So how are we spending? Oh, that's called an expenditure. Always want to have the academic vocabulary. How do we spend our money? How is the government spending its money? Any suggestions on something that the government spends a lot of money on?
War.
Defense, war, military, however you like to put it. I'm going to put defense. Or you could write national security. That's a big expenditure. How else does the government spend money? So we got through taxing and borrowing, and now we're to spending.
Foreign affairs.
Say it again.
That's foreign affairs.
I'm going to put defense with foreign affairs. If foreign policy costs. We actually don't spend all that much on foreign policy. Yeah.
Social welfare program?
Yeah, the things that the government does provide, social services. Now, there's 2 kinds of social services, and we'll really focus on these when we talk about social welfare next period. But just to get the terms down, there's 2 categories. There's entitlements, and there's means tested. Entitlement programs, that means that someone is entitled. Now, on the news, you might hear this, and it has such a negative connotation on the news that you might think that's food stamps. And that's absolutely not. Food stamps falls into means-tested. Means-tested programs are for the poor. And entitlements are really for everyone, like Social Security. No matter how rich or poor you are, if you worked and you paid into Social Security, you get Social Security. You get Medicare. Even the wealthy can get Social Security and Medicare. But means-tested are for the poor. Any predictions what we spend more money on? Absolutely. We spend very little on the poor. We'll explore that next period. All right, now there's a third one that's just going to be really hard to come up with, so I will help you out. This one is called tax expenditures. And what a tax expenditure is it's really money not collected. Now, you guys are pretty young. Most of you haven't had to file taxes, and even if you did, you file exempt, and your tax form is pretty easy. But when you file your taxes, you're asked questions like, do you own a home? You're asked questions, are you married? Do you have children? Have you donated to any charities? In our tax policy, we like to have incentives and punishments for certain behaviors. Taxing is a good way for the government to say you should do this and not that. So if you own a home, for example, you get to write off the interest you pay for mortgage insurance. That means you're going to pay a little less in taxes because you own a home. But it means that the government collected less money. So when the government gives you a tax break, that might incentivize you to behave a certain way, but at the same time that means the government gave up money it could have collected. Okay, so let's put, these are often called deductions or credits. And the purpose of them, purpose here, is to incentivize and punish. So what are some behaviors that are generally accepted as good for society that might be given a tax benefit? Erica?
Marriage and having children.
Okay. So there is some tax benefits, not as many as you'd think, for marriage. And children. So having a family. When you have a family, you put how much income you have, so that's how much should be taxed, and then you're given a deduction, meaning that the government says, okay, but we'll give you a little tax break here. I won't go into the difference between deductions and credits. You have the rest of your life to worry about those. What's another way in which we can use tax policy to encourage certain behaviors? Kieran?
Donate to charity.
Yeah. We want you to donate, so if you donate, you can, they say, write off what you gave to charity. Yeah.
So they give you a deduction for owning a house. Don't do the same for cars.
That's state by state. In the state of Texas, no.
Okay.
For cars, but for homes, home ownership.
Is that punish?
It has more to do with the fact that Texas just does a different tax structure. We don't pay an income tax here, but we pay more in property taxes. Yeah, Rose.
Do you get tax breaks for like solar panels?
Yes. So Going Green has some tax breaks. They're not very helpful, but you know, if you're wealthy enough to afford solar panels, the tax break doesn't hurt. So kind of by not doing these things, you might feel punished by not getting the tax break. The best example I have for a punishment is vice taxes. Does anyone know what a vice tax is? A vice tax is when there's additional tax put on something that seems bad. This is when my smokers look around. Okay, if you're a smoker, a pack of cigarettes is really expensive. When the government wants to come up with money, everyone loves to say, let's just tax cigarettes more to pay for that. All right, let's make the smokers pay for it. So vice tax, it's when we tax something extra. Typically, it's something we want to discourage.
So like gambling too?
Well, gambling
It should, but actually you can write off losses when you gamble. So I can't justify
But I
that.
mean like the lottery. Things like that.
Say that again?
The lottery? There's a lottery.
Oh yeah, the lottery goes to our schools. That was a big justification for allowing for state lotteries, is that the money that's generated would go back to school. Yeah.
Does alcohol have a vice tax?
It has additional taxes and a whole lot of regulation, and that's all state by state. So the big agency that governs that right now is here in Texas, TABC. Okay, so a lot of times on the news, you'll hear like deductions and credits. That's the good side. That's where you've done good things, you get those. But there's the other side to it. These could be seen as loopholes. And the question becomes, is it fair to get these special deductions with how you spend your money? Yeah.
It seems to favor those who have the disposable income to do stuff like that. Like, my family can't donate to charity because we need all the money for ourselves to get food and pay property taxes and bills.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up. I find that some of these do have a skewed way of giving advantage to certain people. For example, if you own a business and you take a potential client out to lunch, and you guys have some steak, dinners, shrimp cocktails, a couple of alcoholic beverages, and your bill is $300, you can write that off as a business expenditure. But if I pack a PB&J every day and I come to work, I can't write off my PB&J. I have to own a business to write off my lunch expense. So people might find these to be loopholes or ways that benefit some groups over others. And why don't we get rid of these? If they are maybe skewed.
Because it gives perhaps like the rich and like that way we can use them more. It's not, like they have a big problem with the fact that we tax them more than of course, so it gives them kind of incentives to have tax breaks.
Well, who might argue for the tax breaks? Who's going to say, let's keep those tax breaks?
People who want to keep their money.
Yes, maybe the wealthy, and who do they send to? Yeah, they send lobbyists. So they're hard to eliminate because the people receiving benefits and lobbyists support them. It's very hard to eliminate anything that has benefits for one group because then that group will continue to guard those benefits. So in a sense, they become, we could say, guarded. Okay, so big picture, if we can see it, we've gone over the process of making a budget, how to balance it, and we've seen income and expenditures. And with this space here, we're going to do history. So kind of our overview of how our federal budget has looked. So what's the word for when our government is constantly spending more than it's bringing in? Constantly spending more money than it's bringing in. Deficit, yes. Okay, so before we do history, I'll write some terminology here. Deficit versus surplus. Spending more than generating. And surplus is the opposite. Generating more revenue and we're spending. So we don't want to confuse deficit with debt. Do I have anyone that can tell me the difference between deficit and debt? Yeah.
Deficit is internal, while debt can be external. Like China holds a lot of our debt, but yeah, actually, I don't know.
No, that wasn't far off. There might be a simpler way of looking at it. Deficit refers to our budget for the year, and debt is the total we owe. Okay? So debt is how much you owe. But when we say deficit, we mean if we look at this year, we spent more than we brought in. And if year after year we spend more than we bring in, we're going to have a big debt. Now, one year we might actually bring in more than we spend. It doesn't mean we eliminate the debt. It means we cut into the debt, but it doesn't mean we eliminate it. So I'm going to be using these terms to describe our history. Times we've been in surplus, times we've been in deficit. And we're going to start with the beginning of time for my class, the 1980s. Okay, so 1980s. In the 1980s, we have amazing deficit spending. Bless you. Up until the 1980s, we had a rather balanced budget. But in the 1980s, we see deficit spending out of control, and then what accumulates is a big national debt. So what's going on in the 80s that might explain massive deficit spending? The government spending more than it's bringing in.
A lot of money in defense.
Yes. Star Wars. When I say Star Wars, what am I referring to?
Reagan's
Reagan's policy.
Ground to air missile. Like, it was protecting our airspace.
Yes. And it got mocked for being, Star Wars. Okay, so we have Reagan is kind of, I'll say here, the culprit, at least his presidency, maybe not the man. But we have insane military spending. Taking the Cold War further. And we'll say Star Wars to help you remember. Because I think my history is going to get out of control, I'm going to start to make a line. It's not as organized as I intended. Okay, what else is going on in the 80s? Maybe we think about Reagan's policies. There was a name. There's actually 5 different names for the economic policy of the Reagan years. Yeah, what's one of them, Savannah? Supply side economics. Where did you learn that? Mr. Underwood. Okay.
It's also called voodoo economics.
Yes, but the fact that you pick one term over the other gives away some partisanship. This is voodoo economics. The terms you choose definitely give away your political standings. Voodoo economics.
That's what Mr. Underwood used, actually most of us use.
Trickle down. Did he use trickle down or voodoo?
Yeah.
Good.
Sometimes. He used them to let us know, synonyms for supply side.
Reaganomics.
Yeah, Reaganomics. I'm not going to fit it in there. I'll run out of room. But all those go together, and we should probably clarify what the heck that means. Did Mr. Cheney go over Keynesianism or supply-side economics?
Yes.
Great. Then that cuts out a whole bunch. But I'll check to make sure we don't have the same understanding. Okay, so Reagan years are looking pretty bad as far as deficit spending. In the later Reagan years, the Reagan administration tries to correct this. They're trying to, okay, we've spent too much, we got to start cutting back the spending. And so the goals from 85 to 90 or so are to reduce spending. Not necessarily increase revenue, though, because that would mean more taxes, and voters don't like taxes. So there's a term for when you want to cut back spending pretty quickly, and it's called sequestration. It's automatic cuts. Now, these can be very difficult because it means that you're going to lay people off, that you're going to cut programs very suddenly, and then people are out of a job and out of benefits. This can be bad for an economy. This doesn't necessarily lead to economic health, but it can lead to a balanced budget. So that's often why government politicians might say, let's just balance the budget by automatic spending cuts. This is what happened in Greece before their economy collapsed. Okay, so this is not necessarily proven to be that successful historically. If you think about it theoretically, you might support it, but if we just look at how it's worked out, it's never been that great. So who comes after Reagan? Next president is Bush Sr. Bush Sr., in my opinion, does not get enough credit. Okay, he's a one-term president. He's elected in, anyone know? That's when he's out of office and Clinton takes his place, so he's elected in 88. So when Bush Sr. comes in, I want to address some of his policies. He comes in 88, and he's on the same plan to balance the budget. And he comes up with this idea that you're going to go, how profound, why weren't we doing it? It's called pay-as-you-go, but it ended up just being called pay-go. And pay-go is something Bush Sr. signs into law. The idea is that for every instance where Congress says, let's spend money here, at the same time, Congress has to have an accompanying bill that says, and we'll tax money here. So every time Congress appropriates money to be spent, they're also having to show how they're getting the money. That for every money spent, there has to be some sort of tax or way to collect it. It's called pay-as-you-go. He signed it into law. And starting then, we see a surplus budget. Doesn't mean the debt from the 80s went away, but it means that now the budget is starting to get more balanced. Pay-go is pretty successful. Now, I said he's a one-term president. He did not get reelected. The main reason he didn't get reelected? He increased taxes. Okay? He promised no new taxes, and in his presidency, there were some new taxes. Did it balance the budget? Yes. Did the voters like it? No. Okay, so pay-go, it's rather successful as far as balancing the budget. What else happens in the 90s, though? We just have a booming economy. We can't ignore that. Booming economy, Cold War over. And in the 90s, we see deregulation. Now, the thing about pay-go is it was legislation signed, but it had an expiration date of 10 years later. So who would be the president to keep it into law? His son, Bush Jr. Now, what was a lesson Bush Jr. might have learned from his dad? Don't raise taxes. You raise taxes, you don't get reelected. So he might have learned from his father the severe punishment the voters will render on you if you dare raise taxes. So it does expire in like 2001, I don't remember when, sometime in 2001. And then we have the 2000s. And this is when our surplus, put in the 90s surplus if I didn't make that clear. Surplus, that doesn't eliminate the debt, but it cuts into the debt. This is when our surplus returns to deficit. And what are some reasons for a return to a deficit? What's going on in our policies in your lifetime?
Since 2000.
2 wars. Wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, so that's going to cost a lot militarily.
9/11.
Yeah, so we have,
Increased, like, interior security.
yes, more security. New agencies created out of 9/11. And Bush has learned an important lesson in politics: don't raise taxes. So in the 2000s, we see all sorts of tax reductions. Okay. I remember before I was paying close attention to what was going on in the 2000s, getting a check from the federal government. It was my tax rebate. I said, ooh, I got a tax rebate. They just sent me money. That was nice. Lots of voters liked that. And overlooked, because Republicans are not supposed to be augmenting the size of the government, Bush signs into law an expansion of the Medicare prescription drug plan. The thing is, unlike PAYGO, there's no plan for how to pay for it. And this is an entitlement program, so it's really going to stick around. Okay, so we're going to conclude with talking about supply side versus Keynesian economic theory. Do you all still have a little bit of room here? Yeah. If you don't, you might have to go on another sheet. So, describes how we tax, spend, and borrow. There's kind of two approaches, supply side and Keynesian. I'm now going to, for my sake, turn it like this. Okay, can anyone tell me what supply side economics refers to? You don't have to give me, lengthy dissertation, just kind of the nuts and bolts. Yeah.
The more the rich spend, the better the economy will become because of money going like through the businesses to the less wealthy people. Therefore, we should tax the rich less.
Great. So if we tax the wealthy less, they're able to create jobs. They're able to open businesses, and that will allow for money to trickle down. So the idea is when we want to improve the economy, we're going to focus on supply, not demand. Okay? So we are going to increase the supply of things. And we do this by cutting taxes for the job creators, for the wealthy. So it's the idea of we're going to cut taxes for job creators so they can do what? So they create jobs. Now, Keynesianism isn't called demand-side economics, but that's sort of how it works. Keynesianism, which we'll just for fun say is demand-side, and this is not the idea to cut taxes, but it will reduce the amount of money that the government has. So this is that the government should spend money. And how does the government spend money?
Creating projects.
Yeah, through projects. So they are also creating jobs. But what else are they doing? Let me rephrase. By creating jobs, they are allowing for people to be earning an income. And if people have money, that's the demand. That's the demand side. If people have money in their pockets, they can go buy their groceries. And that's going to keep the economy going. So we need people to have money in their pockets, but we're going to actually need people to have their money in their pockets to go spend in the economy, not so much to go create those jobs. And this is creating jobs through projects. Yes?
That's like the alphabet soup during the Great Depression when it was creating the CCC and all those
Tennessee Valley Authority.
Yeah, all those agencies to create jobs so young adults could work and not cause trouble.
It's a good way of thinking about keeping order in society. So to convince you of the efficacy of Keynesianism, okay? Let's get specific on how this is good for the economy. I already said one. People have money to spend, and don't need unemployment. Okay? But let's try to look for any other advantages. Can the government get revenue back? Can they earn their money back somehow?
There's income tax.
Income tax. So if we have more people employed, money goes back through income tax. And what's a final byproduct about the government creating these jobs and these projects? Maybe not about the economy as much as our society.
It creates a busier society, like more people are doing things, and then often those projects are for parks or cleaning up a certain area or developing a certain area with houses for other people. It helps create a happier society.
Yeah. So I'll just put improvements because that encapsulates all sorts of things. Improvements that we don't have people unemployed. Those who are unemployed are much more likely to turn to drinking and depression. And then we have better parks and roads, a better infrastructure. So I want to note supply side economics hasn't gone away as a theory, but most economists fall somewhere in the middle when it comes to making recommendations for a government to improve its economy. But for the most part, supply side is seen as something with a negative connotation because of really historically its lack of efficacy, that we haven't seen supply side economics really save a country's economy. All right, we made it through these notes, I think. Let me make sure I didn't skip over anything too fast. Let me not be so negative on supply side. We'll just add why people like it. The idea is people will work more. That if the government's taxing less, you have a reason to work more. Some people would say if we keep taxing those working, then they don't have much incentive to work. That you can produce more, that's the supply side. Work more, produce more, and then, of course, open more businesses. Has anyone in here not done the test, the unit test? Why haven't you seen me? Were you out sick?
Yeah.
Okay. And you?
Sick.
Okay. Was this your first day returning?
Yeah.
I wanted to go over the FRQs, but I can't do that. You guys need to take it. When are you going to see me? You're not in trouble. I'm just